name is Kris Nelson. My site is evolveconsciousness.org, and I will be presenting The Law of Freedom Part 1, Understanding Law and Principle. This will go into law and principle more after defining the law of freedom in order to give a deeper understanding on what exactly is a law and a principle is, because we're going to talk about them in the first part and in subsequent parts to do a real deep dive into the law of freedom. So here is a slide showing the law of freedom and what it means, and an equation as developed by Mark Passio, who I think showed it in Anarchy in the Occult Part 3 a few years ago. So the law of freedom, I shorten it as LOF. I reference it as LOF to not have to say the law of freedom and use that much text all over the place. Simply stated, it means as morality increases or declines, freedom increases or declines. And we have these symbols here. We have this like E-looking symbol. Well, that means the sum, total, or aggregate. And we have F for freedom. And we have M for morality. And I is the individual or an instance of M. So individuals doing morality and instance of morality, you can look at it both ways. And I starts at 0 and it goes to infinity, theoretically. Obviously, there's not an infinite amount of people, and there won't ever be an infinite amount of instances, but there's a lot of them. And the symbol in the middle is a symbol for proportionality. That means a corresponding constant ratio between quantities. And those quantities are freedom and morality. So the sum, total, or aggregate of freedom is proportional to the sum, total, or aggregate of morality. The law of freedom describes the dynamic that governs human freedom, which is morality. The total amount of freedom in an area is proportional to the total amount of moral behavior in that area. The more moral a population is, the more freedom emerges as the condition in that area. The more immoral a population is, the more slavery emerges as the condition in that area. And as an example of how it works for freedom, well, that's the total amount of freedom is proportional to the instance of morality or individual 1, 2, 3, onward and onward added up. And the same for slavery. It's the instance or the individuals who create immorality, and how many there are is how much slavery you're going to have in that area. So is that the end? It's that simple, right? Well, yes, it can be. But do you understand why that is true? Why the law of freedom is something that is actually a law? Why is it true? Or are you just concluding it's true because it makes sense? So when it's presented, well, this can make sense. You'd be like, yeah, it totally makes sense. But just because it makes sense doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It can be a convincing argument, but what makes it true? Right? Do you actually know why it is true? I spent time analyzing why it is or is not true and how it operates in demonstrable ways that anyone can think about and verify. So that's what I'm going to do here, is trying to convey what I've thought about and convey how I've been able to verify and how you can verify it and how it's been demonstrated in human life, so that we can know that the law of freedom is something that is true, that exists. If you already have the detailed knowledge to deeply understand the previous basic explanation, then you understand the veracity of how the law of freedom functions. So then maybe you're not interested in this presentation, and that's fine. If you don't have detailed knowledge, then the rest of this presentation may interest you to understand why the law of freedom is true. Even if you understand how the law of freedom is true, you might be interested in going deeper to comprehend as much as you can about the law of freedom, and will gain value from the rest of this presentation. The law of freedom matters. Why should anyone care about the law of freedom or care to understand it? Because understanding the law of freedom and choosing the positive pathway in the aggregate of humanity leads to the result of not suffering as a species, which is currently not our condition. We are currently suffering as a species in the aggregate overall. Even if you personally, you got a super awesome life, you're still not in an optimal way of life because you don't even realize how your freedom is being stolen from you and how you're not living in true freedom and how that essentially makes you living in enslavement. We can abstract and understand a condition or state of living or existence as having the qualities and quantities of freedom or slavery. We can understand what creates more or less of those qualities and choose to amplify their presence through what behaviors we create into reality. Once the causal choice and behavior is created, we have no choice in the experience of effects as the resulting condition of degrees of freedom or slavery. People don't make the connection between the total quantity of behaviors and the condition that results from those behaviors. That objective morally right or wrong behavior determines if we're truly free or not. Law versus principle. What are laws of nature about? What do they say about the nature of the universe? What are principles? Are laws and principles the same or different? Let's take a look at what dictionaries and etymology have to say as to their meaning. Also, some philosophy about laws of nature. And let's see how laws of nature can help us understand more about aspects of reality. So here we have some dictionary definitions. And I just went and chose some sites that I found had like some decent aspects of the definition that convey the core meaning of what they define. Because as you can see here from Merriam-Webster, this is definition 6A. So there were 1 to 5 and maybe sub-definitions like A, B, or C within each one. So there's a lot of definitions, but I'm pulling out the one that relates to the laws of nature and what they mean. So law definition 6A from Merriam-Webster is a statement of an order or relation of phenomena that so far as is known is invariable under the given conditions. And these are going to be some key aspects of the definition, that it relates phenomena, that it's invariable under given conditions, specific conditions, certain conditions, and they produce certain results. Here's another one from the Cambridge Dictionary. It's a general rule that states what always happens when the same conditions exist. Again, given conditions, what always happens. It's invariable. Examples are Newton's laws of motion, 1, 2, 3, laws of motion, laws of nature and physics. And on the right side with principle. Principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. So principles are used in beliefs. They're used as a foundation for behavior. They're all at the fundamental layer of a belief or a behavior, what motivates behavior or chain of reasoning. They're in philosophy, principles are in philosophy. So principles are in philosophy as a truth, but they're also in as truths about general scientific theorem or law that has numerous special applications across a wide field. So here we can see how principle is often synonymous with law, and they're interchangeable when you're referring to scientific laws or physical laws. It's the same as referring to it as a scientific principle or physical principle. And another definition of principle is a basic idea or rule that explains or controls how something happens or works. So it's again the rule, and you saw how on the law side, you could have a rule. The law was a rule, but a principle is also a rule, because a principle can be referred to as a law. And it's all about talking about how things work. That's what laws and principles are getting at. It's about how things work. And we'll get into principles later on. We can see how principles, so-called principles, that humans have come up with are the criminal justice system. Well, is that really principled? And we're going to find out that no, it's not really principled. Not a true principle, it's a false principle. And then you can orchestrate rules, right? You have rules and explains or controls how something happens or works. So you can have a principle of the criminal justice system that explains how the criminal justice system works, and that there's rules in that system. But is that system itself based on true principles? So it's true that the principles that explain how it works, well, that's true about that system, but is that system based on fundamental principles, on fundamental laws? And we'll see that no, it's not. So then your derivative principles, like the ones you derive for, well, this is how the criminal justice system is going to work, and this is how it's going to explain how it works, and these are the rules of that system. Well, since the foundational principles in nature of the criminal justice system are flawed, then all the principles that are derived to construct that criminal justice system, they're also flawed and false. They're not true principles, they're false principles. And here we have some etymological definitions to get more into the nitty-gritty of the definitions. So we have law from Old Norse, lagu, law, collective plural of lag, as in layer, measure, stroke. So measure is important when you think about the symbolism of ma'at. Well, that had to do with measurement. And that was also, ma'at was a term for referring to law, morality, and truth. So we have measure here. So when you measure things, you can end up deriving principles or laws from those measurements of reality, or measuring behavior, which is how we come up with what the rules of morality are, and natural law, and the law of freedom, and how those are inherent in existence. So something laid down, that which is fixed or set, and fixed, we'll get to that summary of definitions of what a law is, and that's because it's immutable. It doesn't change, it's fixed. So a law is a statement in physics, etc., of an observed, established order or sequence or relationship of phenomena which is invariable under certain conditions. A statement of relation that is true under specific conditions, a mathematical or logical rule. Any statement of the relation of acts and conditions to their consequences. And a principle from Latin, principium, beginning or foundation, from princeps, first. A surface etymology is from primus, first, and seps, catcher. Principle is a fundamental assumption or guiding belief. That's what a principle can be. It can also be a rule or a law of nature, or the basic idea on how the laws of nature are applied. An example is Bernoulli's principle. It can be a law of nature plural laws of nature, like a physical law, which is a scientific generalization based upon empirical observation, a natural law, any number of doctrines in moral, political, and legal theory. So again, the legal theory, flawed foundation, so the whole legal theory premise has false principles in them because they're based on just what humans decide what they are, in contradiction to the fundamental moral principle, the moral law. Again, the same with political. So the moral, political, and legal theories, they're not harmonious. Ontological views about laws. So this is about, we're getting into the philosophy of laws of nature. And there's two main ones, these two ontological views, the study of the nature of being, of what a law of nature is. There's descriptive versus prescriptive. And the descriptive one is known as the regularity theory of laws, and it's non-prescriptive. So the regularity theory is where the theory states that laws describe a regularity or pattern from natural phenomena that we observe. They reflect what happens, describing relationships, but not enforcing them. They're contingent on patterns we observe, that we perceive in nature, which could change. And you'll see how the not enforcing them, based on things that can change because our perceptions can change, how this is not too harmonious with the prescriptive view, because the prescriptive view is the necessitarian theory of laws of nature. I'm just abbreviating them as laws rather than say laws of nature, because that's what laws are. They're actually things that exist in nature. And the legal system laws are not true laws. They're a fabrication that can be in alignment with actual laws of nature, or they can be out of alignment, and they're not laws of nature. And they're just things that people invent for control, arbitrary dictates. So necessitarian theory of laws of nature is that laws of nature prescribe things that must happen. Laws make things happen. Laws are dictating how objects must behave under certain conditions. The laws, how things must behave are imposed upon objects and things in the universe, imposed by the laws. For example, an electron has a specific charge because a law of nature makes it so. The sun rises every day. All objects with mass attract each other. So these prescriptive laws that prescribe what must happen and make things happen, there's two ways that this could happen in the necessitarian theory. One is from the structure of the universe itself, or if it's not built into the structure of the universe, it's, I guess, a property of the entities, the causal power of objects. So there's a property within that aspect of matter at whatever scale that you're looking at it, whether it's an electron or something larger like a molecule, or something larger like a piece of wood. Well, there's things in it, there's properties within those entities that make it so that there's things that happen when there's interactions with other aspects of the universe, so that there's relationships that are formed and certain results that come about through those relationships. So the law of gravity, so when you're looking at the structure of the universe, you can say that the law of gravity itself is what makes massy objects attract. But if you look at it as properties of entities, well, you could say there's a hypothetical graviton quantum particle as a property of mass, which is what makes things attract. So these are ideas in the theory about what is making that attraction. When we talk about gravity, which I'll talk about more, when things attract, well, it has to do with mass, but is it something within the mass, like a hypothetical graviton? Or is it this law, this thing that we're talking about as a law that is making that attraction happen? So these are two aspects within the necessitarian prescriptive theory of laws of nature. And when we're talking about ontology, the nature of being of these laws of nature, there's elusivity to it. So I call this ontological elusivity. Ontological views may be elusive to prove exclusively, as in, can we prove that it's only the descriptive theory and not the prescriptive theory? Or is it only the prescriptive theory and not the descriptive theory? But actually, when we look at the prescriptive theory, it includes the descriptive theory. The necessitarian theory includes the regularity theory, because when you're talking about this and you're defining it, these laws of nature, you're also describing that regularity or pattern which brings you to be able to say that, oh, well, that keeps happening. It's a pattern. It regularly happens. So then it's called a principle or a law. And then it's just taken a bit further in saying that, okay, well, that law is making it happen. But anyways, ontological views may be elusive to prove exclusively, but that doesn't negate the importance of laws to better understand how reality functions by explaining particular phenomenon, why they happen, or how the phenomenon was brought about, not why laws exist at all, why they work the way they do, nor where they come from. So when we're looking at laws, we're not talking about why they exist at all, why they work the way they do, or where they come from. We're just talking about why certain phenomenon happen and how the phenomenon was brought about. Because you're talking about things relating, interactions of relationships, and those interactions like mass and the distance between the mass, well, that produces the law of gravity, the law of universal gravitation, as Newton came up with, which is a good approximation as we're looking at it on Earth for how it happens. It's good enough to understand how it works. Specific conditions necessarily produce resulting conditions. We create statements or equations to describe those events, referred to as laws. They are good enough measurements for the precise functionality of the universe. We see a pattern about how reality works, then the pattern, regularity, it regularly happens, so it's a pattern that we notice, is recognized as a law. We describe it the best we can, but can't truly explain why it is that way. That is to say, why the law is that way, why the law exists. For example, we don't know why the law of gravity works out to be an inverse square law. Force is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between the bodies. And why not the inverse cube, or the inverse power of 4, 5, or 6? It is what it is. Law versus accidental truth. So when we're talking about laws, there's laws which are generalized truths, and then there's just accidental generalized truths, which are not laws. Necessity helps to differentiate laws of nature from accidental truths. For example, no human lives to be 122 years old. So far, that's been the case. It's either, I think haven't gone up to 122 or past it. We haven't gotten to 123. Maybe it's happened before, maybe it'll happen in the future, but so far that hasn't happened. But that's not a law. Or the accidental truth of all the coins in my pocket are dimes. Well, though true at the time that no human being has lived up to or past 122 years old, and all the coins in my pocket are dimes, it's not a physical necessity, hence the necessitarian theory. Someone could live beyond 122 years, or I can have more or less dimes in my pocket at any time. If physical necessity is ignored in determining what a law of nature is, then there are nearly a limitless amount of laws. Laws of nature rule out certain outcomes from occurring. which accidental generalizations don't. Laws are also universal in applicability and not contingent on human observation or understanding. Planets orbited around suns according to laws of physics long before humans figured that out. There are laws themselves that we discover and human approximations to those laws. So we discover through observation the patterns, the regularity, that things happen under certain conditions, you get certain results. So there's that thing in the universe that is like, okay, well, this is the way it works. And then we create scientific laws or other principles that are trying to approximate and give specifics about how that happens. So it might be that the actual way the universe functions, like behind the scenes and in the precision of how it all works, we might be off by a hair or a fraction or something. But in general, the law that we come up with the equation is a good enough approximation to those laws that we're reflecting through those statements or those equations. While laws and accidental or coincidental truths can be generalizations, the latter lacks necessity and universality, as in it applies everywhere. General summary of law. Law relates phenomena, something making something else happen or occur. They are inherent. They are a natural part of existence, nature, reality, not invented by anyone. They are invariable or immutable. They can't be changed. They're always that way. They're inviolable. They're unbreakable. They can't be violated. They are binding. They're mandatory, necessary under certain specific conditions. So under different conditions, well, it won't be binding, it won't be mandatory or necessary because the conditions are not present for that emergence of the effect as dictated, as reflected in the law, that the law makes it happen or that it must happen according to the law because the law is a reflection of how the universe functions. So if your conditions are different, well, the conditions are not going to be the requirements necessary to fulfill the results that those, if the conditions that are reflected in that law were present, then those conditions would operate according to how the law states that they operate. Rules stating or describing what must happen, which is an effect, from the relationship, interaction, or behaviors of various conditions. Effect invariably follows a cause, and that's causality. The same conditions, the cause, equals the same result or occurrence, which is the effect. If X, then Y. It's invariable. It always happens. If you have X, those initial specific certain conditions, then you get Y. And that's what the law demonstrates. The law is reflecting that invariability of given these specific conditions, you can reproduce it. If you can reproduce these conditions, then you'll always get the same result. And that's how the scientific method works. Initial conditions are causes. They generate an effect, and the new state condition emerges. For example, mass and distance can produce the gravitational force of attraction. The laws explain how the effect relates to its causal conditions. It describes the relation of cause to effect. How do we get from this condition to another condition? It doesn't explain why or how the cause is able to produce the effects. It's only looking at how there's a relationship between certain things present in the initial condition and also how that relates to what is produced, but doesn't explain, well, why does that happen? Why does the law work that way? Why is that law there? We can't go that deep into the causal explanation. We don't have those answers. It's a generalization, a general rule or equation based on empirical observations. Equations can be precisions or approximations of the inherent law in reality. And here are just a list of some physical laws to get an idea if you want to go look at what are these scientific physical laws. There's more than this. Here's just one, some that I found on a site listing them. So you can take a look at that. I won't bother mentioning them. So some ways that we can categorize laws of nature. We have deterministic laws, such as Newtonian mechanics. So an example of those is the first, second, and third laws of motion, which have to do with inertia, momentum, and every action has an equal opposite reaction, which is essentially cause and effect. The laws of universal gravitation, those are Newtonian mechanics. There's other laws, such as the ones from the previous slide. You have the law of inertia, or sometimes referred to as the principle of inertia. You have the laws of thermodynamics. So those are all in the deterministic laws. There's also probabilistic laws or statistical mechanics, and that's indeterminism in contrast to deterministic laws. These are indeterminate. So when we're dealing with social or economic development, there's laws about economics and how they work, like supply and demand. I think that one would fit there. I'm not sure if that's deterministic. It's probably indeterministic. Anyways, these are some categorizations I found for explaining how laws of nature can be categorized. But they're usually based in probabilities, like social things. It's not a given specific way that society must work, but there's a tendency. So when you look at psychology, they do studies in sociology and psychology of large numbers of people, or even psychological studies between individuals can vary. But in the end, even in epidemiology and medicine and other sciences, you can have probabilities. You take that certain results, you take a sample size of 1,000 people and you do an experiment like the Milgram experiment on authority, and you'll get a result of like 65%, or you'll have side effects of drugs. Well, you'll have probability that the result is just a fluke, or does it have a strong correlation between a cause and an effect, that the cause and effect are actually linked as a cause to an effect, and the correlation is strong, or it's just a weak, well, this is a perceived cause to the effect, but we don't really know because, the results vary too much, and there's not enough strong evidence to conclude that this is like happening very frequently. So unlike deterministic laws, they're not happening all the time. Maybe it happens 90% of the time or 70% of the time. But you keep repeating it and it keeps happening 70% of the time. So there's something happening, and there's other factors that might make it that it doesn't happen all the time, such as free will. Hence why in psychology and sociology, it doesn't always happen. Another probabilistic law, statistical laws, are quantum mechanics, the probability wave function, etc. And we also have natural processes, deterministic or not. We have chemical reactions where you can add baking soda and vinegar, for example, and that gives you the reaction. A kid's science experiment of the volcano exploding. Well, that's the double displacement reaction and the decomposition reaction. So you can look into that and other examples of chemical reactions and natural processes, such as water's boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. Water's freezing point is 0 degrees Celsius. Types of principles. So there are different types of principles in our lexicon. Not all things declared as principles are true, though they are used as foundations. So again, remember that principles, a core aspect of it is it's fundamental, it's a foundation. So this is how we can have foundations within us, but not all of them are true. So we can have true principles that are based in truth, reality. They're true foundations. So inertia, causality. True principles as laws of science, gravity, inertia, causality, or true principles of philosophy, like logic. There's laws of philosophy, a system of logic, framework of logic, laws of logic, principles of logic, and also self-ownership, self-defense, non-aggression. These are all true principles. We can have professional or personal principles, and these are just things that are valued or established standards in that profession. So these are all foundations of a profession, or that you use personally as a foundation within you, that you then use to as a basis for how you're going to live your life, how you're going to base your actions upon and your behavior. So in programming, there's principles and standards like solid, dry, KISS, SOC. Scientific standards or scientific principles of how to do things in scientific research, such as objectivity, empiricism, inductivism. So a personal principle that someone can adopt is trust everyone, and that would be foolish. Or someone can adopt the principle of trust no one, and that's impractical. Or another good one is question everything you hear, read, or see, which is prudent to avoid being fooled. Question everything. And there's false principles, and these are justifications for how to behave or think, usually. They're false foundations. So looking at how survival or self-preservation is the highest law. And that's a foundational part of Satanism in the Church of Satan. And might makes right. Survival of the fittest or survival of the strongest. Again, part of Satanism. Or authority is necessary for human society and order. So you can't have order without authority. You can't have human society without authority. Well, these are false foundations. These are false principles. And then you develop, the system of authority and the legal system based on that, which dictates to people what they can't do, that they are actually morally and principally, in truth, allowed to do, and then punish them for things that you say they're not allowed to do, but they actually are allowed to do. Or make them do things, force them to do things that are wrong, under penalty of hurting them more than if they comply. Principles as drives for behavior. The importance of principles. Principles can be taken into our inner selves as foundations. These might not be laws of nature, but they act as, quote, laws we bind ourselves to for our conduct or behavior when we adopt them into our thinking. Thought informs behavior. Ideas or concepts that we find value in are used as foundations to stand on, to direct our actions. And that's what the image at the bottom is. You know, a little stick figure standing, and that's what those principles are driving behavior, because that's the foundation you're standing on. And you can have bullshit foundations, or you can have true foundations. And you have things that are arbitrary, but they're not too prudent. Principles act as a launch pad to leap into action from. It's important to not take in false beliefs as foundations. That's one of the definitions of principles, is that they can be a foundational assumption or belief. So then you believe in something, and that's what you base your actions upon and how you live. In ancient Egypt, Ma'at, as a concept represented by the goddess Ma'at, meant morality, truth, and justice. One of the symbols to represent Ma'at, or Ma'at, was a plinth, and that's what the foundation is. It's a plinth. Objective morality, moral truth, is the most important foundation to have in life. Always base your decisions and behavior from that base foundation of morality, law, love, agape. What's in your foundation that you use as footing to direct your actions? Do you know if it's true? Do you care? Is objective morality there? The law of gravity. It's a discovery from a fact to a principle to a law. So I like to use the law of gravity here just to show how we can relate observations, and from those observations and derive facts of what's happening in reality. Then we can build a principle around it and then go even further towards a law. So this is how a principle isn't a law. In the derivation, in the statement of the principle, it's not actually a law. And that's because, as I mentioned in the summary for a law, a law is immutable, it's binding, it's invariable, it's inherent. So you'll see here in the first derivation of the principle of gravity, you can see how it's not invariable. Because you note that an apple fell from this tree. So that's a fact. The apple fell. That happened in reality. It's a fact. It was in the tree and then it fell down. Why didn't it fall up? Why didn't it rise up? Why didn't it go sideways, one way or the other? Why didn't it explode? Well, that's not the way reality works, right? So the apple fell from the tree. So then you recognize that, well, if you throw the apple up, it's going to come back down. If you throw a rock up, it's going to come back down. So then you derive a principle from that repetition, again, that regularity theory of something that regularly happens. It's a pattern. Well, what goes up must come down. You repeat the process and the same result happens, the same conditions of throwing a massy object up, and the result is that it comes back down. So that's a principle. What goes up must come down. It's a statement of a principle. It's not a principle as a law. The equivocation in the scientific field, where they call some things principles or they call them laws and they mean the same thing. This is really going from a fact towards a principle where what goes up must come down. And why this is not invariable is because you can go into outer space, which nullifies the statement because it isn't specific enough. It doesn't state the conditions when it applies or not, and that you have to be already in the presence of a gravitational force strong enough for attraction to occur in order for the force that you propel upwards is not strong enough to escape that gravitational force, so then it comes back down. So then we can get to the strength of gravity between any two objects, like the earth and an apple being thrown up, like an apple in the earth, depends on the masses of the objects and the distance between them. So this gets formalized as an equation of the force of gravity is proportional to the gravitational constant times mass 1 and mass 2 divided by the distance between them squared. And that's the law. So it was the law as a statement, which was more specific, and it's the law as an equation. So this describes the relationship or behavior between facts under certain conditions. So here we're getting more of an understanding of how this all works together and the definitions of how, how it relates phenomena, so the relationship or relation of things in existence, and under certain conditions where things interact, there is a relationship of an interaction, and those conditions produce another condition. So in this case of gravity, a large enough mass and another mass, well, then you have gravity and there's an attraction. The physical laws are expressed through an equation that relates aspects of reality. The law of gravity has an equation that gives an approximate value for the force of gravity. It explains the relationships that produce the effect and occurrence of an apple falling to the ground. The law of gravity describes what happens with mass and distance to get gravity. The noticeable effect of gravity isn't present everywhere, but when large enough masses and certain relative distances are present, then the force of gravity visibly emerges. And if the distance is too large, like when you go into space, well, then you're not falling back down to Earth because you're not close enough. Again, specific conditions is what make it emerge and be visibly observable. So this is just a side bubble of Newton's law of universal gravitation is usually stated as in this wordy format of every particle attracts every other particle in the universe with a force that is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between their centers. Why is there the law of gravity? Why is there gravity? How does gravity come about? What causes mass and distance to develop the emergence of gravity? Why does mass and distance produce gravity? The law of gravity humans came up with is describing the relationship of mass and distance. The actual interaction relationship of mass and distance themselves are why gravity manifests. Without mass, there is no gravity. If the masses are too far apart, there is no gravitational effect. But that still doesn't answer why mass and distance allow for the emergence of gravity. So we might not know why things work this way, just that it is this way. The law is how we make sense of how things relate and interact to produce additional effects that aren't present without the initial specific interacting conditions. Is the law akin to something itself in the background inner workings of the universe that takes input and produces output like a program does? It seems like it, not that it is that, not that it is a program, but it seems like it. What we've created in terms of programs and code, well, that like mimics the functionality of how the universe works. So we've recreated an analogous functionality to how you can also look at how the universe works. It can be corresponded. How we've created programming and code in computers, well, we can use that as an analogy to correspond to something else that we're trying to understand, which is the universe and how it works. So it looks like it has similar functionality to the way a program does, where it takes input and then in the background there's this thing called a law that processes it, and then there's the output. So there's the initial condition, the interaction relationship between things, and then once that is present, then it produces the output. Law reflects how the universe has functionality that allows and hence makes or controls how initial conditions produce the effect condition. This is a continuation of why is there the law of gravity, talking about this idea. An additional factor to gravity and the interaction of mass and distance is space-time curvature of general relativity. So that can help us understand more of how gravity comes about. It gives us more information, more of an understanding of how it happens. We don't know exactly why it is there in the first place or what makes it happen. Again, you can look at the law as what makes it happen, because there's like an input of an initial condition, specific certain conditions, and then there's a result, and those initial certain conditions are happening in reality as opposed to not happening. So there's something in reality that allows that to happen. So hence why It's looked at in the prescriptive theory, ontological view of laws of nature, as the necessitarian theory of being prescriptive is that it makes things happen, it controls, it governs how the initial conditions produce the effect condition. Because one's a cause, and then there's an effect, and in between there's the processing of the universe, things in the universe that allow the functionality of the universe itself, those processes that allow that to happen in the first place, as opposed to the interaction happening and the result not happening, or a different result happening instead of how it currently works. So we have space-time curvature, and this was, I think, confirmed. It was theorized by Einstein and then confirmed when they looked at how light was bending around very massy objects, like I think it was black holes or planets or suns. So mass and energy, when you understand space-time curvature, go look into it. It's pretty interesting. There's like a dual relationship, how mass and energy tells space-time how to curve. So when there's mass and energy, it curves space-time. So as the light moves through, it curves around the object. And because there's that space-time that's curved, it also tells mass how to move. So mass and energy tells space-time how to curve, and space-time tells mass how to move. Because once there's that curvature in the space-time, that's how we're able to conceptualize it. Then things curve around it because of that sinkhole. When you look at the visualizations, that's the easiest way for us to comprehend it, is there's a flexible sheet, and you put a ball in it and it curves in. Well, when you put something else, you try to put it across, well, it'll go into that curve and then pop out. Anyways, it's really interesting to look into. But still, we're left at, well, why does mass create curves in space-time to pull things closer to the mass as it moves through space-time? Is a hypothetical graviton at the micro-quantum level of mass the reason? Why would quantum particles like quarks and leptons make a graviton exist, if it does at all? Does it all come from the underlying field, that unified field? Why does the field do this? There is a constant begging the question. It seems like an endless why and how. Does the chain of causality end somewhere with a prime causer? Is it an infinite regress? Can it ever be known? Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we can't hypothesize about it to try to figure it out. In the end, what matters is knowing that there is an effect, such as that we call gravity, and that it's caused by mass and distance, which are how the force of gravity increases or decreases. So what matters is knowing there's an effect. In all of our observations about how certain conditions produce certain effects, and then we can describe it through a principle and use statements, and then maybe an equation to quantify it more precisely. We still have these questions, well, why does it work this way? Why is there this law? Why isn't there some other law? What matters is that this is how it is, and knowing that there is this effect from this cause. And this is also what matters for the law of freedom, that there is freedom, that effect, or slavery, that effect of slavery, and that morality of behavior, the cause, is how freedom increases or decreases, which is to increase the amount of enslavement. That's what matters in understanding laws, not about why the laws are there, but just about that the laws reflect an understanding of the functionality of things in the universe. The principle or law of causality. Causes invariably precede effects. Effects equal what happens. Causes equal why effects happen. There is a relationship between cause and effect. Why does causality work that way? What caused causality to work like that? It seems impossible to answer with certainty and is also self-referential, implying it is omnipresent. So that's what laws are. And when we think about causality, what caused causality? Well, what whiteness made white? It's self-referential. What caused causality? Well, you're talking about the thing itself. You can't use it to explain itself. So in that respect, we can't answer why it's this way. It's just that way. It's a fundamental component of reality, a true axiom. And it's a principle or law that's a foundation before all others. Because if you're talking about gravity or inertia, we're talking about mass. We're talking about certain conditions, specific conditions being present, that then produce other conditions as a result. So we're talking about cause and effect. So cause and effect is fundamental to all the other laws. There's always cause and effect present. There's always something present, and because it's present, well, then we can understand laws or principles and create equations to represent those states, those conditions that are present as an effect. There's always causality. But some say causality is an assumption with no evidence or illusion, despite its obvious demonstrability. So I mentioned this before with the scientific method, if X then Y, the scientific process of experimentation of a hypothesis and repeatability of results necessitates that a condition-specific cause produces the same effects. So a specific condition will produce the same effects. That's if X, then Y. And that's how things work in programming. Under X conditions, you get Y results. This fundamental quality makes it a or the prime principle or law. That's how I view it. The principle or law before all other principles or laws that deal with more specific aspects of reality, for example, gravity or thermodynamics, etc. You can't have an effect without a preceding cause. In summary, principles are foundations, fundamentals. They help to recognize the existence of laws. They can be properties of laws or laws themselves. Laws, accurately enough, represent relationships, interactions, or, quote, behavior, quote, behavior in reality. And by behavior, I put it in quotes because, we're not talking about necessarily human behavior. In the scientific realm, behavior is anything that does something. So a rock rolling down a hill, well, that's behavior. Where was I? Laws accurately enough represent relationship, interactions, or behaviors in reality. So accurately enough. Maybe we're going to be off by 0.00000000001% of how it actually works behind the scenes in reality, but it's good enough. Whatever. When we come up with things, sometimes they'll be poor and they need to be refined, but eventually we get a good enough representation in those equations that are derived through the observations of how things function in reality. So laws are fixed, invariable, inviolable, universal, always operate the same way given the same criteria or conditions. They reflect underlying functionality of the universe that prescribes certain conditions will produce certain results. Which are described by statements or equations. Alleged, quote, principles, such as, for example, authority is natural or that it's necessary, can be false and used to invent false, quote, laws, so-called laws, that violate rights or principles, that violate true principles. And therefore, they're used to justify immorality, to make something, quote, right that is actually wrong, or make something, quote, wrong that is actually a right. For example, the false principle that using alcohol or cannabis is immoral. Not objectively immoral, but subjectively immoral. and then creating laws to make it illegal or criminal to have or use. The legal law is not a true law. Putting things into your body conforms to the true principle of non-aggression and self-ownership. So this is how you can see how principles and laws that they come up with in the legal system and the criminal code, well, these are flawed because they're based on flawed foundations. They're not based on true principles such as non-aggression and self-ownership. Principles can possibly be violated. Law is inviolable. So that's where you have some principles as they're derived, like when I gave the example of gravity on that statement. What goes up must come down. Well, it wasn't inviolable, so it can be violated. So some true principles can be ignored or violated. For example, what goes up must come down. The non-aggression principle or the self-defense principle, check out my previous presentations on that, on the natural law, the science of morality, part 1, part 3, and part 4. They deal with that more. So those principles can be adhered to or not. They can be violated because they're not a law of nature. They're a principle in nature, but they can be violated. Non-aggression principle is violated all around us. The self-defense principle is denied all around us. It's not enacted. The law of gravity can't be violated. Given specific conditions, it emerges or manifests. The law of gravity states plus or minus mass and distance equals the amount of gravity present. The law of freedom can't be violated. See, it's an actual law of nature, whereas principles can be not laws. They are true, but they can be violated. So the law of freedom is inviolable. Results are based on conditions or causes present, which is the presence of moral behavior or not the presence of moral behavior. There is choice on how to behave. The law of freedom doesn't make, prescribe, or force us to do anything. It's only describing or prescribing that certain results will come about based on our choices. So you choose moral behavior, well, the more people that choose moral behavior and the more moral behavior there is, well, the more freedom we will have to potentially reach true freedom, and then the less enslavement there will be. And conversely, choose immoral behavior. So as I state here, the law of freedom states plus or minus aggregate moral or immoral behavior equals the amount of freedom or the amount of slavery that we end up getting. And causality is fundamental and can't be violated. You can't remove causality, cause and effect. It can't be violated. So that's why it's essentially a law. It can be viewed as a principle, like in philosophy and in reasoning, there's causality. You reason from cause to effect. And in physical laws, well, it's a law because there's cause and effect in how things occur. And that helps us reason about them to figure out what's happening. Causality underlies all laws, the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the law of freedom, etc. Causality is a base descriptor for interactions in reality. Laws aren't the initial cause that makes certain conditions produce certain results. Those specific conditions are what make the results happen. So again, the law of gravity, well, it's mass and the distance between them and how large the mass is. Well, that's the initial cause that makes the result happen, because if those specific conditions aren't present, well, you're not going to get the result of gravity. It doesn't matter what the law is. If the conditions aren't there, you're not getting the result. You're not getting the effect. So one is an initial cause. And law represents what allows causal conditions to generate the resulting condition. A specific condition always leads to another, and a law reflects the process that leads to, controls, and governs what must happen. So thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate that you watch this. Hope you gain value, and there will be several more parts to come. This was a long presentation, so I decided to chop it up into different parts rather than make another 8 or 9-hour presentation. The last one, Natural Law, the Science of Morality, Part 4, Morality, it was 8 hours and it was long enough, super long. So I decided this time I'm going to do them in segments, and then maybe I'll add them all together and I'll do one big presentation at the end. It'll allow me to refine things even more, make improvements along the way. So thanks. Take care. Peace.